Welcome back, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today because this story is something special. It's about unexpected connections, difficult choices, and a moment that changed everything. If you enjoy relaxing storytelling like this, take a second to like the video. It really helps the channel grow. And feel free to say hello in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let's begin.
The Mafia boss had only 24 hours left to live, and when his funeral began, the nurse walked in carrying something that would bring the entire Chicago underworld to its knees. The siege of room 702. Ice-cold liquid slid down the chin of Aries Donovan, soaking through the hospital gown and choking the breath that machines were barely keeping alive. "Swallow it. Please, you gotta swallow it." A child's voice cracked through the sterile silence, shattered by pure panic. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a nurse. It was a boy. Couldn't have been older than 5. Dark hair matted with sweat. A faded superhero t-shirt swallowing his tiny frame, and sneakers so destroyed the left sole had peeled clean off. His small, trembling hands were squeezing a dented plastic bottle, pouring the liquid desperately into the mouth of the most feared man between Chicago and Detroit. The chaos in the intensive care unit exploded in under 3 seconds. "What the hell is going on? Get that kid away from him!" Griffin Donovan's roar slammed against the glass walls. His $5,000 suit couldn't hide the vein hammering on his neck, and the face that was always calculating was now twisted into raw, uncontrollable horror. Beside him, Pearl Donovan shrieked, crushing the silk Hermes scarf over her hair. "He's killing my brother-in-law! Someone call security!" she screamed, stumbling backward on designer heels into 2 board members frozen solid by disbelief. The boy didn't flinch. His gray eyes, bloodshot and swollen, were locked onto the corpse-pale face of Aries Donovan. "Wake up. You promised me, Dad. Drink it, please," he sobbed, forcing the cracked bottle between the colorless lips of the dying king. Machines erupted into screaming alarms. The cardiac monitor spiked into wild, jagged peaks. Aries Donovan began convulsing, hands seizing the sheets with inhuman force, eyes rolling white, lungs clawing for air that wouldn't come. "He's choking," Griffin snarled, lunging forward, grabbing the boy's arm hard enough to bruise. "Let go, you little rat." "No, he's got to drink all of it," Jonah screamed, twisting like a trapped animal. But it wasn't the child who fought back hardest. From the doorway, a woman in wrinkled blue scrubs exploded into the room like a storm, made of exhaustion and fury. Freya Langston, night shift nurse, dark circles so deep they looked permanent, lunged past the guards and threw herself between the boy and Griffin's grip. "You want to touch this child? You go through me first," she snarled in a voice that didn't belong to a woman who barely weighed 120 pounds. It belonged to a mother. Guards burst in. A medical cart crashed. Syringes and glass scattered like shrapnel. "Get them both out. Throw them on the street." Pearl spat, pointing at Freya and the boy like they were demons crawled up from hell. They grabbed Freya by the shoulders and ripped Jonah from her arms. "The bottle. Don't let it fall," the boy wailed as the dented plastic slipped from his fingers, bounced off the bed rail, and spilled its last drops onto the white tile. At that exact moment, Aries Donovan's body went still. He collapsed into the mattress. The beeping dissolved into one long continuous tone, and a flat green line burned across the screen. Silence swallowed room 702, broken only by the mechanical wail of the monitor. Jonah's fading screams down the hallway, and Freya's voice cracking as she called his name. Pearl covered her mouth, performing a choked sob. But above her fingers, her eyes darted sideways, hungry, searching for Griffin. Griffin straightened his cuffs, exhaled one quiet breath nobody caught, and stared at his brother's body without a single tear. Only the cold satisfaction of a man who'd just won the lottery. "It's over," he murmured. "The king is dead." But what these 2 vultures didn't notice, blinded by greed and the Flatline's victory song, was that beneath the soaking sheet, the fingers of Aries Donovan had slowly curled into a fist. If this story's already got your heart racing, hit that like button so more people can find it, share it with someone who loves a killer twist, and subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's rewind 24 hours to the moment the death sentence landed, and the most dangerous game Aries Donovan ever played began. 24 hours before the green line stretched straight across the monitor screen in room 702, the air conditioner in the VIP suite at St. Albans Hospital was running at a freezing temperature, yet Griffin Donovan was still sweating. He paced back and forth, his Italian shoe tips tapping in a relentless rhythm against the marble floor, while Pearl sat on the white leather sofa, scrolling her phone with an indifference so cold it bordered on the pathological. The heavy oak door opened, and Dr. Helen Nash walked in. Her white coat didn't have a single crease, but her face carried the weight of a verdict. She held a metal file folder, closed the door behind her, and looked at the only two relatives of the most powerful patient in the city. "I won't beat around the bush," Dr. Nash said, her voice slicing through the silence like a scalpel. The collapse at the board meeting wasn't caused by stress. The toxicology results and the CT scans are very clear. Aries is in simultaneous acute liver failure and acute kidney failure. The aggressiveness is unprecedented. I've never seen internal organ damage progress at this speed. Pearl locked her phone screen, set it on the glass table, and quickly put on a look of pain that had clearly been rehearsed. "What are you saying, doctor?" she said, her voice trembling as her hand rose to her diamond-glittering chest. "My husband was as healthy as a horse. He works out every day. He eats clean. This can't be happening. There has to be a cure. I demand you bring in a specialist from the Mayo Clinic immediately. Money isn't an issue." Dr. Nash shook her head slowly. "There's no time to transfer him, Mrs. Donovan. Aries' organs are shutting down in sequence. His heart is forcing itself to pump blood that's been poisoned. We've put him in a medically induced coma to reduce the pain, but the damage is irreversible." Griffin stopped in the middle of the room. He stepped close to Dr. Nash, invading her personal space, his eyes two cold, calculating black pits. "Give me a specific number, Nash. I hate medical poetry. How long does my brother have?" Dr. Nash held his gaze without flinching. 24 hours at most. And I'm being optimistic when I say that. I'm truly sorry. She gave a small nod and walked out, leaving the death sentence hanging in the freezing air. The door clicked shut. Griffin and Pearl stood still for 10 seconds, listening to the doctor's footsteps fade down the hallway. Then, suddenly, Pearl's grieving posture evaporated without a trace. She let out a deep sigh, sank back into the white leather sofa, and crossed her legs, revealing the red soles of her Louboutins. 24 hours, Pearl murmured, and a thin smile slowly spread across her dark red lips. "Dear God, Griffin, it's finally over. I thought this day would never come. That arrogant tyrant was going to bury us first." Griffin didn't smile. His face was a mask of pure strategic tension. He walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. In the distance, the smokestacks of Donovan Steele's mills sent plumes into the dirty gray sky. An entire empire. "Don't celebrate yet, Pearl," Griffin growled, pulling his phone from his suit pocket. "Aries is dying, yes, but the power transfer on the board isn't ready. If he dies right now, the stock will crash at market open tomorrow morning. I need time to freeze the investment accounts before the minority shareholders panic." "Calm down, you're the vice chairman," Pearl said, her tone lazy with smug satisfaction. "We are his only surviving family. Everything will default to us. He doesn't have a wife. He doesn't have kids. He has no one but his beloved, patient family." She let out a dry laugh with no humor in it. "I'm selling that Gold Coast mansion right after the 9-day prayers are over. I can't stand those ancient furniture pieces he picked." Griffin was about to answer when the phone in his hand vibrated. Incoming call. Private number. He picked up, brought it to his ear, and glanced at Pearl with a furrowed brow. Donovan speaking. The voice on the other end was rough, formal, and completely without emotion. It was Attorney Prescott, Aries Donovan's personal lawyer and legal shadow for the past 2 decades. "Mr. Donovan, I'm sorry about your brother's condition. However, my legal duty requires that I contact you immediately." "Prescott, this isn't the time. We're facing a family tragedy. Call back next week," Griffin said, ready to hang up. "I'm afraid it must be right now, Mr. Donovan," Prescott pressed, raising his voice just enough to dominate, especially because of what happened yesterday afternoon. Griffin froze. A cold surge ran up his spine. What happened yesterday afternoon? Aries locked himself in his office all day. Pearl caught the shift in Griffin's voice and sat up straight on the sofa, alert like a snake. "Yesterday at 6 o'clock, 6 hours before he collapsed, Aries summoned me to his private office," Prescott explained, each word dropping like a slab of stone. "He made a comprehensive and irrevocable change to his will. The previous version has been completely voided." The phone nearly slipped from Griffin's sweat-slick hand. "What change?" he hissed, instinctively stepping away from Pearl, lowering his voice. "I'm the executor. I'm the primary heir to the controlling share package. He promised me. You are no longer the executor, Mr. Donovan. And Mrs. Pearl is no longer the sole beneficiary either. Prescott's voice was ice, uncracked. Aries left extremely specific instructions. 95% of his assets, bank accounts, real estate, and the majority share package of Donovan Steel are now placed in a blind trust. That's illegal, Griffin shouted, losing all composure, slamming his fist into the glass. He has brain damage. I'll take this to court before his body's even cold. Who's the beneficiary, Prescott? Say it. What name did that bastard write on the paper? Silence. On the other end, paper rustled as it was opened. That's the problem, Mr. Donovan. There's no name. Griffin clenched his jaw so hard his temples throbbed. Don't play with me. I'm reading Clause 7 verbatim, handwritten and signed by Aries himself, Prescott said, not wavering even slightly. All my assets and absolute control of my legacy shall be granted only to the person who possesses physical proof of the promise I made at Navy Pier 10 years ago. Whoever presents that proof at my funeral will be the one and only lawful heir. If no one appears, the entire empire is to be liquidated and donated to charity. The silence in the VIP room became suffocatingly heavy. What proof? What damn pier? Griffin whispered, feeling the floor vanish beneath his feet. I don't have that information, sir. My duty is only to read the will when the funeral concludes and verify the proof if anyone appears with it. Have a good evening. The call cut off. Griffin lowered the phone slowly and looked at Pearl. The high society mask had vanished from her face completely, leaving only the raw horror of someone about to lose everything. What is it? Griffin. Tell me. Pearl clawed at her husband's arm with sharp nails. Griffin stared into nothing, his eyes bloodshot. Aries cut us out of the will, he whispered. He changed everything yesterday. He's going to hand the empire to a stranger. To someone who has something called proof. Pearl staggered backward, bumping into the glass table. No. He can't do this. We've waited too long. I've sacrificed my whole life for this family. Her voice climbed, turning into a crazed hiss. His brain's poisoned. The doctor said his brain is being destroyed. Shut up, Griffin snarled, grabbing Pearl's shoulders and shaking her hard. Listen to me, Pearl. No one can know about this. No one. We've got less than 24 hours before he dies and the funeral happens. Griffin's eyes darkened with lethal resolve. The polished businessman disappeared, replaced by a hunting predator. I don't know what that proof is. I don't know who Aries is waiting for, Griffin hissed, pressing his face close to Pearl's. But anyone who tries to step up to my brother's coffin, I'll crush them. No one's taking this company from us, even if I have to soak the church floor in blood. The sound of a cognac glass shattering against the dark oak-paneled wall cracked through Aries Donovan's private office like a gunshot. Amber liquid splattering across a Persian rug, worth more than any Donovan Steel employee's yearly income. It has to be here. Look harder, Griffin roared, grinding a shard of glass beneath the tip of his Italian shoe. Aries' private office, buried deep inside the untouchable Gold Coast mansion, looked like a storm had torn through it. Thick volumes on corporate law and international finance lay strewn across the floor, their pages ripped loose. The drawers of the solid oak desk had been yanked out and flipped over with brutal force. Pearl Donovan, her makeup smeared by sweat and desperation, flung stacks of documents, bank files, and contracts onto the floor. Her trembling hands, heavy with diamond rings, pawed blindly through the mess of paper. There's nothing, Griffin, nothing at all. It's all quarterly reports, board minutes. There isn't a single line about a peer or any promise, she hissed, collapsing to her knees in the scattered paperwork, clawing at the collar of her silk blouse. He's going to throw us into the street. Us, his own flesh and blood. Griffin breathed hard. His hollow black eyes swept the library walls, hunting in desperation for a hidden safe, a false panel, anything that could hold the secret Aries had buried for 10 years. The clock was running, 18 hours since the doctor's diagnosis. Aries was still in a coma at the hospital, and time was slipping through their fingers like sand. Griffin seized a heavy bronze statue from the desk, a wild bull, the symbol of a bull market, and strode toward the locked metal filing cabinet in the corner. If that cold-blooded bastard thinks I'm going to let some bastard child or some old mistress from the past come claim my seat on the board, he's dead wrong. Griffin hissed through his teeth, then raised the statue. One savage blow crushed the lock. Metal snapped and sprang open, Griffin wrenched the drawer out with such force it nearly tore free of the rails. Inside there was no gold bar, no checkbook, no bearer bonds. There was only an old shoebox tied with a black leather cord. Pearl sprang up from the floor, nearly stumbling, shoving Griffin aside to peer into the drawer. "What is that? Open it, now," she demanded in a shrill, frantic voice. Griffin tore the leather cord and lifted the lid. Silence dropped onto the luxurious room like a suffocating blanket. They both stared at what lay inside, their temples pulsing. There was no physical proof the will mentioned. Nothing of value at all. Only letters. Dozens of envelopes, yellowed by time, sealed shut, with no sender name. All addressed in the same flawless handwriting that could belong to no one else but Aries. Diana Chen, Southside, Chicago. And beneath the stack of letters, a photograph faded by the years. Griffin picked it up with stiff fingers. In the photo, Aries Donovan was much younger, without a tailored suit, without power, and he was smiling. A real smile, bright and unguarded, the kind Griffin had never once seen on his brother's face in his entire life. Beside Aries, pressed close to him, was a woman with jet black hair, dressed simply, but with eyes that burned. Behind them, the unmistakable structure of Navy Pier stood sharp in the late afternoon sun. "Diana Chen," Pearl whispered, as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. "I remember her, that assembly line girl, dirt poor. Our father threw her out when he found out Aries wanted to marry her. He swore he'd forgotten her." Griffin crumpled the photo in his fist, crushing the two smiling faces into a useless ball of paper, his jaw clenched with cold, calculated fury. He never forgot, and the proof of that promise is with her, or with someone carrying her filthy blood. Griffin spat, contempt packed into every word, as he flung the paper into a corner. "The will says someone will show up at the funeral. That means they know Aries is dying, or they're about to find out." He turned, strode to the desk phone amid the wreckage, and dialed with violent precision. 2 rings passed before the other end picked up. "Briggs," Griffin barked into the receiver, saying the name of Donovan Steele's head of security, a former soldier notorious for his complete absence of conscience. "I want St. Albans Hospital under absolute lockdown immediately." "Sir, we already have 2 guards in the hallway on the 7th floor," the rough voice on the other end began. "I said absolute lockdown, you idiot," Griffin screamed, slamming his fist onto the desk. "I want men at the main entrance, the loading area, the fire stairs, and the ventilation shafts if you have to. No one except me, Pearl, or the medical staff gets up to Aries' floor. If you see any woman named Diana Chen, or anyone who doesn't look like they can afford to pay the bill in that hospital, throw them out. If they resist, handle it clean and dump them far away. Am I clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. I'll reinforce security right now." "No one will reach room 702. Griffin hung up, breathing hard. He looked at Pearl, and in her eyes he saw the same murderous panic reflecting his own. "No one is taking this company from the Donovan family," Griffin declared, straightening the wrinkled cuff of his shirt. "The old man will die alone in that bed, and when we bury him, that will become worthless paper, because no one will be able to bring that stupid proof to the funeral. We own Chicago." What Griffin Donovan's $1 million security machine and meticulous calculations couldn't foresee was that the deadliest threat to his steel empire wouldn't arrive in the form of an army of lawyers or a vengeful mistress. It would arrive in the form of an exhausted night shift nurse, with dark circles like permanent bruises beneath her eyes, walking into her 10 o'clock shift at that very hospital with a misshapen plastic bottle hidden in her coat pocket and a 5-year-old boy slumped asleep on a chair in the nurse's lounge. While Griffin Donovan deployed his war machine inside the most luxurious private hospital in Chicago, 15 kilometers south, on the other side of a city the upper class pretended didn't exist, Freya Langston was trying to shove a cheap box of pasta into a microwave whose dial had broken last winter. Her Southside studio wasn't much bigger than a federal cell. The paint peeled off the walls in yellowed sheets. The rusted pipes ticked steadily all night like a broken clock, and the central heat had been dead since November with the landlord not bothering to fix it. Freya wrapped another thin blanket around Jonah's shoulders as he sat on the only fold-out bed in the room, legs swinging, big gray eyes watching her with a seriousness that didn't belong to a 5-year-old. If anyone asked Freya Langston where she came from, the answer would be nowhere. Her mother died on the delivery table at a public hospital on the west side of Chicago, less than 4 minutes after Freya's first cry. No father on the birth certificate. No grandparents, no aunts, no uncles. only the system. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, swallowed her before she'd even opened her eyes to the world and spat her out 18 years later after wringing her dry. 7 foster families before she aged out. The first family locked her in the basement whenever guests came over, because they didn't want anyone to know they'd taken in a child for the stipend and still didn't feed her enough. The third family returned her to the system after 6 months, because they said she was too quiet. Normal kids should be happier than that. The fifth family used the DCFS money to buy alcohol and put a combination lock on the refrigerator. Freya learned to crack that lock at 12, not because she was brilliant, but because she was so hungry her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and she still had to try combination after combination until she heard the click. When the system released her at 18, she had no diploma, no bank account, and not a single person on this earth calling her by name who truly wanted to know if she was okay. She slept in a homeless shelter in Englewood for 7 months, taught herself for her GED under the flickering fluorescent lights of the common room. Then she took on a massive student debt she'd be paying until she was 40 to earn her nursing certification. Because if no one had taken care of her when she was little, at least she could become someone who took care of others. Now, at 27, Freya worked back-to-back shifts at St. Albans Hospital, the night shift from 10 o'clock at night to 6 in the morning, then sometimes picked up an extra afternoon shift when someone called out sick. Her paycheck barely covered the studio rent, the student loan payments, and boxed pasta for 2. Yes, 2. Because 3 years ago, on a stormy night in March when the Chicago wind screamed through every alley, Freya was on a night shift when the emergency department doors flew open and a security guard walked in carrying a little boy, maybe 2 years old. Someone had left him at the hospital gate on soaked concrete. No identification, no note, only a silver bracelet engraved with the letter J on his tiny wrist, a heavy piece of metal wrapped in greasy gray cloth shoved into the pocket of the child's coat, and bruises on his small arms that Freya recognized instantly because she'd carried the same bruises throughout her own childhood. The toddler cried without sound, the silent kind of crying kids learn when they've realized loud crying doesn't change anything. Freya lifted him into her arms, and, for the first time in her life, she felt something inside her chest break and then rearrange itself into an entirely new shape. The child stopped crying. For the first time since he'd been found, he lay still in a stranger's arms and closed his eyes to sleep. A DCFS worker arrived the next morning. They were going to place him into foster care. The same system Freya understood better than anyone on earth would crush a 2-year-old with no one to protect him. Freya looked at the social worker, looked down at the child gripping her finger in his sleep, and said, "I want an emergency foster placement." She didn't have a big home. She didn't have stable income. She didn't have any of the conditions the system considered ideal, but she had one thing no foster family among the 7 who'd taken her ever had. She truly wanted this child. And somehow, in the middle of the bureaucracy's endless failures, her application was approved. She named him Jonah because of the J on the silver bracelet. She put the bracelet and the cloth-wrapped metal object into the bottom drawer of her nightstand and never opened the cloth to see what it was, because she believed it belonged to the child's past, and that past had abandoned him in the rain, so it didn't deserve to be looked at again. 3 years passed, and Jonah became Freya's entire universe. "Aunt Freya," the boy's voice called, pulling her out of memory, small but strangely solemn. "What is it, sweetheart?" Freya knelt to his eye level, smoothing the tangled black hair on Jonah's head. Today at daycare, a man in black came. He was really big. He stood outside the fence. Freya froze. Every nerve in her body, sharpened by a lifetime of instability, went on full alarm. "What did he say to you?" "He gave me this," Jonah said, pulling an old, misshapen plastic bottle with no label from his small backpack, its cap scratched and not screwed on tight. Inside was a clear liquid that sloshed softly as he handed it to her. "He told me to give it to Aunt Freya at the hospital. Room 702. He said it's medicine, not water. If Aunt Freya doesn't give it to the patient in that room before midnight, he'll really die." Freya held the bottle in both hands, feeling as if she were cradling a grenade with the pin already pulled. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Did he say anything else?" Freya asked, forcing her voice steady, though it trembled at the end. Jonah looked at her with clear gray eyes and delivered the next sentence in a calm so frightening it could only belong to a child who didn't understand the weight of each word. "He said he's my real dad, and if Aunt Freya is scared, tell her he knows she grew up with no one, and he doesn't want his son to grow up like that too. The words drove straight into the deepest wound Freya had carried for 27 years. She sank onto the floor, back against the frame of the fold-out bed, staring at the misshapen bottle in her hands, then at Jonah, the child she'd raised for 3 years on boxed pasta and unconditional love, the child she'd sworn the system would never swallow the way it had swallowed her. Her mind spun with calculations. If she carried an unknown liquid to a patient she wasn't assigned to, she'd violate every medical rule, lose her license, lose her job, and lose custody of Jonah because DCFS would deem her unfit. If she did nothing and that man truly died, she'd live her whole life with the shadow of a death on her conscience. And if that man really was Jonah's biological father, then no matter what she did or didn't do, she was about to lose the child she loved more than her own life. Freya closed her eyes, breathed, opened them. She put Jonah on the bed, tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and told him she'd be back soon. Then she slipped the plastic bottle into the inner pocket of her scrub coat, stepped out of her unheated studio, and started toward St. Albans Hospital through the knife-cold Chicago night. She wasn't going to deliver medicine. She was going to find out what room 702 really was. At midnight, the 7th floor hallway at St. Albans should have been empty, except for machines and the footsteps of nurses changing shifts. But when Freya reached it through the east stairwell, what she saw stopped her cold. Men in black suits stood at every elevator door. Men in black suits stood at the head of every stairwell, coiled wire earpieces, eyes sweeping the corridor like wolves patrolling territory. This wasn't hospital security. Freya knew hospital guards wore dark blue uniforms and carried radios on their belts. These men carried guns hidden beneath their suit jackets. She pulled back behind a corner, heart hammering, and peered through the narrow gap toward the far end of the corridor where the number 702 glowed faintly in the dark. The patient in that room wasn't ordinary, and the man in black had sent the bottle through a 5-year-old because he understood this was the only line of defense no one could break with guns or money. It could only be crossed by a night shift nurse who knew every inch of this building better than the people who'd built it. 3 drops. Just 3 drops of a clear, odorless liquid. That was all it took to bring down a king. 72 hours before the green line stretched across the monitor in room 702. 72 hours before Freya Langston would be hiding behind a 7th floor corner, watching armed guards patrol the corridor. Donovan Steel Industries' main office was shaking under Aries Donovan's rage. The 37-year-old man, fueled with the ferocity of a bull in fighting season, hurled a thick audit file straight into Griffin Donovan's chest. Papers exploded through the room like funeral confetti. "You're a useless parasite, Griffin," Aries roared, bracing both hands on the oak desk and leaning forward as if he meant to swallow his brother whole. $30 million vanished in the refinery project. You think I wouldn't notice? You think my auditors are as stupid as you are? Griffin stumbled back, his face drained, swallowing hard. "Aries, please." Raw material import costs spiked. "I was just trying to balance the books so the board wouldn't panic." "Don't lie in my office." Aries slammed his palm down, making the crystal glasses on the drink cart rattle and sing. "You've been bleeding this company for years to pay your gambling debts in Macau. I tolerated it because you share my blood, but it's over. You're fired. Today I'll prepare your resignation letter, and thank God if I don't throw you in prison before the weekend." Pearl Donovan, seated in a leather armchair in the corner, stood immediately. Her face showed no fear, only an absolute coldness that went all the way to the bone. Around her neck was her signature Hermes silk scarf, dark floral patterns wrapped neatly like a fashionable suit of armor. "Aries, sweetheart, you're going to have a stroke." "Calm down," Pearl said, moving to the drink cart with steps measured to the millimeter. "You're too worked up. Let me pour you a whiskey. You need to slow your heart rate before your bank meeting this afternoon." "Don't use that motherly voice with me, Pearl," Aries snarled, loosening his tie, his face purple with fury, breathing hard. "I know you know about this. You and your husband are leeches. The gold mine is dried up for both of you." Pearl turned her back to him. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from pure adrenaline flooding every vein. This was the moment she'd waited for. Her fingers slid to the knot of the Hermes scarf at her throat. Hidden in the fold of that expensive designer fabric was a tiny glass vial, no bigger than a thumbnail, no label. She'd bought it 3 months earlier through a broker in Prague for a price high enough to buy a condo in downtown Chicago. A synthetic compound derived from thallium, engineered to slip past standard toxicology screens and mimic perfectly the symptoms of spontaneous acute liver failure. The original plan had been to administer small doses over the course of a year, slow and silent, without suspicion, like a death symphony played in adagio. But Ares threatening to fire Griffin changed everything. There was no time for elegance. It had to be now. 1 dose. Maximum. Fatal. Irreversible. Pearl popped the vial open with a swift, practiced motion, poured 30-year-old scotch into a cut crystal tumbler, and tipped the entire vial into it. The poison dissolved into the amber liquor without a bubble, without a shift in color, without a trace of scent. So perfect, even the devil would have been jealous. She tucked the empty vial back into her scarf, turned, and walked toward the desk with the patient smile she'd rehearsed 100 times. "You're right, Ares. Griffin made an unforgivable mistake. We'll fix it. But first, drink." "You need your blood pressure down before you see the bank," Pearl said, holding the glass out with a hand that didn't shake. Ares snatched it with a rough movement. His breathing was still heavy. He glared at Griffin with bone-deep contempt, then lifted the glass and drained it in one swallow, letting the whiskey and the poison burn down his throat. He slammed the empty glass onto the desk. "I want your offices cleared out before sunset," he declared, turning his back to stare through the window at his factory smokestacks. Not even 20 seconds passed. Ares clutched his stomach. A dull moan, almost animal, forced its way out of his mouth. The file in his hand dropped to the floor. His knees buckled instantly, his body crashing into the bulletproof glass before sliding heavily down onto the carpet. He began to convulse, both hands clawing at his throat, eyes rolling back, thick white foam coating his mouth. Griffin lunged forward, panic swallowing him whole. "Oh my God, I'm calling an ambulance," he shouted, fumbling his phone out of his pocket with clumsy fingers. "Stop!" Pearl's voice snapped through the air like a whip. Griffin froze with the phone halfway to his ear. He stared at his wife. Pearl stood perfectly still, watching her brother-in-law writhe on the floor, choking on his own saliva. "What did you do, Pearl?" Griffin whispered, horrified as the truth finally landed. Pearl adjusted the silk scarf at her throat with a calm that was almost inhuman. She glanced at the gold watch on her left wrist. "What had to be done to protect our assets?" she answered, never taking her eyes off Ares's dying body. "If you call an ambulance now, they'll pump his stomach, and he'll destroy us." Ares clawed at the carpet. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, searched for his sister-in-law's face, begging in silence, while his organs began to burn from the inside out. But before darkness swallowed his mind, Ares's right hand reached for the phone that had fallen a few inches away. His fingers shook as they touched the screen. The wallpaper lit up. The face of a little boy with black hair and gray eyes, his mirror image, Jonah, the biological son he'd been searching for 3 years since Diana disappeared. The child his private investigators had finally located a month earlier on Chicago's South Side, cradled in the arms of a night shift nurse living in an unheated studio. Ares stared at his son's face on the screen, his finger tracing the boy's cheek through the glass. Then his eyes slid shut, and his body went still. "Wait 2 minutes, Griffin," Pearl ordered in a voice that sounded like the devil, folding her arms as she listened to the last ragged breaths of the man who shared their blood. "Let the poison finish the job. 2 more minutes and we'll own Chicago." Freya returned to the third-floor nurse's lounge, with her heart pounding so hard she could hear each beat echoing inside her skull. She'd seen the 7th floor. She'd seen the men in black suits with guns hidden under their jacket hems guarding every corner. And she knew that whoever lay in room 702 belonged to a world ordinary people shouldn't step into if they wanted to stay alive. But Freya Langston had never been ordinary. She'd survived 7 foster families, nights so hungry her stomach clenched in the basement of strangers, a homeless shelter at 18. Fear wasn't unfamiliar to her. It was an old companion she'd learned to walk beside a long time ago. She sat down in the swivel chair in the lounge, opened the medication cabinet with the key on the lanyard around her neck, and pulled a strip of pH test paper from the rapid test kit. Her hands were still trembling, but her movements were precise, professional instinct carved deep into muscle. She twisted the cap off the misshapen plastic bottle, tipped it carefully, and let a single drop fall onto the paper. 15 seconds. The strip changed color, not the reaction of ordinary water, not saline, not any solution she'd seen in 5 years as a nurse. This was a biological compound, complex, and completely outside the limits of her knowledge. Freya stared at the bottle, stared at the test strip, then looked toward the lounge door where Jonah was slumped asleep on the waiting chair. his head tilted to one side, his small hand still hugging his backpack to his chest. The man in black had said it was medicine. If she trusted wrong, she'd kill someone. If she didn't trust, someone would die. And that someone could be the biological father of the child sleeping there. Freya closed the cabinet, locked it, and started planning. 5 years of night shift work at St. Albans had turned her into a living encyclopedia of this building. She knew official security changed shifts at 11:30, a 15-minute gap while the two teams handed off. She knew the service conduit ran along the east wall, connecting the 3rd floor to the 7th, through a side stairwell only maintenance and senior nursing staff could access with a badge. She knew the loading dock behind the hospital, where industrial laundry trucks came and went every night, was the only blind spot in the camera system, because steam from the dryers fogged the lens year-round. But Griffin's security weren't hospital guards. They didn't follow shift schedules. They didn't have blind spots, so she'd have to make one. Freya woke Jonah gently. He opened his eyes instantly, not groggy, not crying, just looking at her with gray eyes too clear, too aware, the survival instinct of an abandoned child, always ready, always alert, even in sleep. "Listen to me," Freya said, calm but serious. "I'm taking you somewhere. You have to stay still and you can't make any sound, like we're playing hide and seek. Can you do that?" Jonah nodded without asking a single question. Freya carried him down to the basement through the west stairwell, where fluorescent lights flickered and the smell of bleach mixed with damp fabric into a thick, suffocating air. The laundry area. She found a steel mesh industrial laundry cart, the kind used to haul dirty sheets, dumped the linens out, and lined it with neatly folded clean sheets from a nearby shelf. She placed Jonah inside, pulled a white sheet up to his chest, leaving only his small face exposed. "Stay still here. Don't move. I'm going to push you, and if anyone asks, this is just laundry." Jonah grabbed her hand, squeezed with tiny fingers, then let go and closed his eyes. Freya draped another sheet over his face and pushed the cart out to the loading dock behind the hospital. The knife-cold Chicago night hit her full in the face. An industrial laundry truck was parked there for the workers loading bundles. She rolled the cart forward as if she were doing routine work, her heart pounding like madness inside her chest while her face stayed perfectly blank. The first near miss came at the first-floor freight elevator. One of Griffin's guards stood smoking beside the exit door and turned to look at her. Freya didn't slow down, didn't look away, simply nodded with the exhausted end-of-shift smile every nurse knew how to wear, and pushed the cart into the elevator before the doors closed. The second came on the 5th-floor corridor, as she transferred from the freight elevator to the East Service stairwell. A black-suited guard walking the other direction stared straight at the cart. Freya felt Jonah go rigid beneath the sheets. She pretended to stop and check her phone, let the guard pass, then kept moving. On the 7th floor, she stopped the cart at the top of the East Service stairwell. Through the crack of the door, she saw 2 of Griffin's guards posted at both ends of the hallway, one near the main elevators and one directly in front of room 702. She needed both of them gone at the same time. Freya glanced left. The trash chute at the end of the corridor, where nurses and orderlies dumped disposable items after a shift. Mounted on the wall beside it was a manual fire alarm pull box. She pulled Jonah out of the cart, tucked him behind the stairwell corner, and said, "Wait here. Count to 30. Then run into the room with the number 702 as soon as I call you." Freya stepped into the 7th floor corridor and walked straight toward the trash chute with the casual posture of a nurse taking out the last trash of the night. The guard outside room 702 watched her but didn't stop her, because she wore blue scrubs and a staff badge. She reached the chute, turned her back to block his line of sight, and yanked the fire alarm. The alarm shrieked through the 7th floor silence. Red lights flashed along the ceiling. By hospital procedure, anyone not on the fire team had to move toward the nearest stairwell to check. The 2 Donovan guards, even though they weren't hospital staff, reacted to the sound anyway, leaving their posts and jogging toward the fire panel near the main elevators to confirm the situation. 30 seconds. That was all Freya had. She sprinted back down the corridor, swiped her staff badge at the electronic lock of room 702. Green light. The door opened. She lunged inside and Jonah ran in right behind her, his battered shoes slapping the tile. Freya saw Ares Donovan for the first time. She saw the ruined shell of the most powerful man in the city, lying motionless on the bed, skin gray as ash, tubes everywhere, eyes shut, chest rising weakly with the ventilator's rhythm. She was a nurse. Her eyes went straight to the vitals monitor. The heart rate was weak but steady. Blood pressure dangerously low. Liver and kidney indicators glowed red on the screen. This man was dying. Truly dying. Not acting. And she was holding something that could be an antidote, or could be a second poison. Freya uncapped the bottle, tilted Ares' head to the side with practiced technique, one hand lifting his chin to open the airway, the other using her index finger to press gently at the base of his tongue to trigger the swallowing reflex. She dripped it in, drop by drop, slow and patient, making sure each drop went into the esophagus and didn't spill into the trachea. She'd given hundreds of comatose patients medication this way. Her hands didn't shake, not because she wasn't afraid, but because when Freya Langston did the work she was trained to do, fear didn't get a seat. Jonah stood on the other side of the bed. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He only slid his tiny hand through the bed rail and took Ares' motionless hand, small fingers closing around large, pale fingers. And in that moment, under the cold fluorescent light of an ICU room, a father and a son touched for the first time, without either of them understanding it. Freya had given about 2/3 of the bottle when the door burst open. And everything that followed, Griffin's roar, Pearl's scream, the brutal hand seizing Jonah's arm, Freya throwing herself in the way, guards flooding in, the bottle falling, the monitor flattening into a straight line, it all hit exactly like the storm this night had been destined to become. When security dragged Freya out of room 702, the 7th floor night charge nurse was already waiting in the hallway, her face paper white. "Your badge, Langston," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Freya looked at her, looked at Jonah sobbing in her arms, then slid her badge off its lanyard and placed it in the charge nurse's hand without a word. 5 years. 5 years of night shifts. 5 years paying student loans. 5 years building the only path that had ever lifted her out of the bottom. All of it vanished into a piece of plastic. She carried Jonah down the stairwell, through the loading dock, and out the back gate of the hospital. The Chicago night wind cut through her thin scrubs. Her shoulder was torn where a guard had grabbed her cheek bruised where she'd slammed into the doorframe as they yanked her out. Jonah clung to her neck, face pressed into her shoulder, tears soaking the fabric. "Did Dad wake up, Aunt Freya?" he whispered. Freya didn't answer because she didn't know. She only knew one thing. Before the bottle hit the floor, before the monitor went flat, she'd seen something no one else in that room had seen because they were too busy screaming and performing. She'd seen Ares Donovan's throat move. A swallow. He'd gotten enough of the dose down. And so, in the cold wind and darkness, jobless and with everything lost, Freya Langston held Jonah tight on the sidewalk behind St. Albans Hospital and smiled. Inside room 702, the moment the door slammed shut and cut off Jonah and Freya's cries in the hallway, medical hell erupted. "Code blue," I said, "code blue." Dr. Helen Nash roared as she shoved the door open and charged in with 4 nurses sprinting behind her, pushing the crash cart at full speed. The nursing team shoved Griffin and Pearl aside without bothering to be polite. Nash climbed onto Ares' bed, stacked her hands on the Mafia boss's chest, and began compressions with desperate force. Cartilage and ribs cracked under the pressure, the sound snapping through the room, grotesque enough to make Pearl clamp her hands over her ears with perfectly performed horror. 1 milligram of epinephrine. Push it through the central line, Nash shouted without stopping compressions, sweat streaming down her forehead. Charge to 200 joules. A nurse ripped away Ares' damp gown, exposing his pale chest. Another smeared conductive gel on the defibrillator paddles. Charge to 200. Clear. Nash yanked her hands off Ares' chest. The paddles slammed down. The Mafia boss's body arched off the bed, the electrical shock lifting him 15 centimeters before dropping him back onto the mattress like a sandbag. Every eye snapped to the monitor. A straight line. No heartbeat. No electrical signal. "Charge 300, Nash ordered, throwing herself back into compressions, her arms trembling with exhaustion, sweat dripping onto Ares' unmoving face. Another dose of epinephrine, now. The second shock was even more violent. Machines on both sides of the bed screamed alarms. Ares' body jerked with horrifying power, but when he fell back, the slackness of death was undeniable. His skin, already pale, began to shift toward a dull gray waxen tone. A nurse looked at Dr. Nash and slowly shook her head. "Doctor, there's no carotid pulse. Pupils are dilated and fixed." "No neurological response," the woman whispered, stepping back. Nash froze, still holding the paddles in the air. The weight of medical failure settled onto her shoulders. She stared at Ares Donovan, the most powerful man in the city, defeated by multi-organ collapse no science could stop. She lowered her hands, drew a deep breath, and looked at the digital clock on the wall. "Stop resuscitation," Nash said, her voice dimming like a candle running out of wax. "Time of death, 1:14 a.m. Griffin bowed his head and covered his eyes with one hand, hiding the icy smile threatening to tear through his grief mask. They'd won. The king was dead. And the nurse and the street kid, whoever they were and wherever they came from, hadn't brought any proof. Only a dirty bottle of water. Ares's will was now worthless paper. The empire was his. Pearl sobbed theatrically, shoulders trembling in a perfect rhythm, a flawless performance for the hospital security cameras. But beneath the sobs, her nails dug into Griffin's arm with the force of victory. While Dr. Nash began removing the useless tubes from the body declared a corpse, 3 floors and an entire world away, outside the back gate of St. Albans Hospital at 2 a.m, the wind off Lake Michigan carried a cold that went straight through bone. Freya sat on a concrete bench beside the staff parking lot. Jonah curled in her lap, head pressed to her chest, tiny hands still gripping the collar of her scrubs, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. He'd stopped crying, but his body still shook, whether from cold or fear or both. "Aunt Freya," Jonah whispered, his voice hoarse from too much crying. "Did Dad wake up?" Freya wanted to say yes. She wanted to say everything's going to be okay because that was what adults always told children when they didn't know what else to say. But Freya had never lied to Jonah, because when she was little, adults always said everything's going to be okay, and nothing ever was. Not once. "I don't know, sweetheart," Freya whispered, pulling Jonah tighter, her chin resting on the top of his head. "But I know one thing. No matter what happens, no matter who comes or goes, I'll never leave you alone. Never." Jonah didn't answer. His breathing slowed, steadied, and after a few minutes he fell into exhausted sleep in Freya's arms, in the knife-cold Chicago wind at 2 a.m. Freya closed her eyes, pressed her back against the freezing bench, and for the first time that night, allowed herself to feel the weight of everything that had just happened. She'd lost her job. She'd lost her only income. She'd broken every rule of nursing practice. And she could lose custody of Jonah if DCFS found out she no longer had financial stability. A single tear, heavy and burning, slid down her cheek in the cold night, but she wiped it away before it could fall into Jonah's hair. She wasn't allowed to break. Not now. Not ever. An engine sound cut through the silence. Freya's eyes opened instantly, every alarm inside her snapping on, arms tightening around Jonah as she prepared to run. A sleek black SUV, the kind she only saw in movies or parked outside restaurants she could never afford to enter, rolled to a stop directly in front of her. The headlights went dark. The engine went quiet. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out wasn't tall, but he was built like a brick wall. Shaved head, a scar running from his right temple across his cheekbone, black eyes as expressionless as obsidian. He wore a black tactical jacket, no weapon visible, but the way he moved, each step planted solid and silent, said he was the kind of man who didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. "Freya Langston," he said, not a question, a statement. Freya clutched Jonah, spine pressed to the bench, every muscle tight. "Who sent you?" she hissed through her teeth. The man stopped 3 steps away, holding a deliberate distance, both hands relaxed at his sides so she could see he wasn't reaching for her. "My name is Steele. I run Ares Donovan's private security detail. Not Griffin's, Ares's. And I'm the one who sent that bottle to the boy at the daycare gate this afternoon." Freya didn't loosen a single muscle. "He's dead." The monitor went flat. "I saw it with my own eyes." Steele didn't move. His voice stayed as flat as a frozen lake. "He isn't dead. The liquid in that bottle is an experimental antidote compound synthesized in Switzerland on Ares' private order. It neutralizes thallium in his system, but it has an extreme side effect: total neuromuscular paralysis and suppression of the heart rate down to 1 beat every 3 minutes. No standard hospital equipment can detect a heart rate that low. To every machine in room 702, Ares Donovan is dead, but he's alive. His brain is fully awake. He can hear everything. Freya felt the ground tilt beneath her. "She poisoned him," Freya whispered, and it wasn't a question. Suddenly everything locked into place in her mind. The abnormal results, the organ failure progressing too fast, and the way Pearl Donovan screamed for security instead of calling a doctor when Aries convulsed. Aries knew ahead of time, Steele said. His private physician in Switzerland detected thallium in his blood last week. He needed them to deliver the final fatal dose so he'd have evidence no one could deny. Everything tonight, the collapse, the hospital, you, was part of a plan he set in motion before he lost consciousness. Why me? Freya asked, her voice tearing at the end. Why send the antidote through a 5-year-old instead of coming to me directly? Because Griffin controls every line of communication inside the hospital. Every medical staff member is being watched. The only person no one would suspect is a child. And the only person Aries trusted to act for Jonah, not for money or power, was the woman who's raised his son for 3 years without asking for a cent. Freya closed her eyes. Piece after piece snapped into place with a painful click inside her head. His son. Jonah really was Aries Donovan's son. And she'd raised the son of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago in an unheated studio on boxed pasta for 3 years. There's one more thing, Steele said, taking a single step closer. The metal object wrapped in cloth the boy carried when he was abandoned at the hospital gate 3 years ago. You still have it. Freya opened her eyes. Her heart missed a beat. The nightstand drawer, the bottom one, the heavy thing wrapped in greasy gray cloth she'd never opened because she thought it belonged to a past that had abandoned Jonah and didn't deserve to be looked at again. That is the proof the will requires, Steele said. It is the only thing in the world that can prove Jonah's inheritance rights. And you need to bring it to the funeral tomorrow. Freya looked down at Jonah asleep in her lap, his small face peaceful in the storm. She looked at Steele. She looked at the black SUV, and she understood that her life from this moment on, would never be the same again. Take us, Freya said, standing with Jonah held tight, her voice no longer shaking. I need to grab something at home first. The cork of a Dom Perignon bottle popped and smacked the hand-carved plaster ceiling of the Donovan mansion's main library like a celebratory gunshot. Golden foam spilled over the lip of the bottle, and Griffin Donovan didn't bother wiping it. He filled 2 baccarat crystal flutes to the brim, his hand still trembling slightly, not with the panic of the hours at the hospital, but with the pure adrenaline of a man who believed he'd won. He crossed the huge Persian rug and handed 1 glass to Pearl. She sat before an enormous gold-framed mirror in the living room, touching up her waterproof mascara with the precision of cosmetic surgery. She'd already changed. A black haute couture morning dress, custom-made in Milan, cost more than the entire house of any worker in their steel mills. To the fallen king, Griffin lifted his glass, greed glittering in his eyes beneath the chandelier's crystal light. And to the new owners of Chicago, Pearl took her glass. Her reflection returned a smile as cold and sharp as a razor. She clinked her husband's glass. The crystal ringed with a perfect note in their ears. To us, darling, and to the lovable stupidity of forensic medicine, Pearl murmured, taking a long sip. What did the morgue say? Any problems with the death certificate? Griffin let out a dry laugh and loosened his black tie. Nothing at all. Nash signed 20 minutes ago. Acute multi-organ failure. The poison you bought is a miracle. It doesn't leave a trace. His liver was so destroyed they assumed it was silent cirrhosis, gone bad. No one will investigate. Aries Donovan is officially a closed medical case. Pearl leaned back, closed her eyes, and exhaled with a pleasure so twisted it was almost obscene. 15 years, Griffin. 15 years swallowing his shouting, his humiliation, watching him donate millions to ridiculous charities while we had to beg the board for raises. It's over. Tomorrow morning I want the interior design team here. I'm ripping every piece of old-fashioned wood paneling out of this house. Griffin nodded and turned to pour more champagne, but his always calculating mind replayed every detail of the afternoon and night. One small detail, like a splinter under a fingernail, wouldn't stop throbbing. The guards lost the girl. No, that nurse, Griffin said, his voice dropping suddenly. Pearl opened her eyes, irritated at the interruption of her power fantasy. What nurse? That filthy little thing at the hospital. So what? She spoke like she knew Aries. And the boy, Pearl, the boy had gray eyes. Griffin turned back to his wife, the crease between his brows deepening. Gray eyes exactly like Aries. Not normal gray, identical. And she ran into that room without caring about the guards, without caring about anything, like her life wasn't worth a cent compared to the man on that bed. Pearl rose and walked to him with decisive steps, snatched the champagne bottle from Griffin's hand, and set it on the table with a clean, hard thud. "Look at me, Griffin. Look into my eyes," she ordered, gripping his lapel. Aries is lying on a steel table in the morgue, frozen at -4 degrees. His brain has been without oxygen for hours. He's dead. Dead. That nurse is just a night shift lunatic who snapped from exhaustion, and that boy is some street kid she picked up somewhere. That bottle didn't do anything except make him choke and speed his heart up until it burst. They did us a favor. Forget it. Griffin studied his wife for a second, searching for a crack in her logic. He found none. The monitor had gone flat. He'd seen Aries' skin turn that waxy gray of the dead with his own eyes. He drew a deep breath and let arrogance swell back into his chest. "You're right. Stress is making me paranoid. I ordered Briggs to double security for tomorrow night's event. No one enters the funeral without a wax-sealed invitation. We're locking down 3 blocks around the church." The phone on the oak table began to ring. A direct line from the most prestigious funeral home in the country. Griffin picked up. "Mr. Donovan, everything is ready," the funeral director said with solemn formality. "We followed Mr. Aries Donovan's pre-death instructions exactly. The casket has been fully sealed, precisely as he specified in the contract he signed a month ago." Griffin frowned and exchanged a confused look with Pearl. "Sealed. A contract from a month ago. My brother didn't expect to die. Why would he demand a sealed casket with that kind of advance preparation? I want an open casket so the press can photograph the family saying goodbye. I'm very sorry, Mr. Donovan. This is a non-negotiable clause notarized in advance, Mr. Aries required that his body not be displayed under any circumstances, and that the solid black oak casket be tightened with steel bolts before it leaves our facility. The casket is already in the hearse and on the way to the church." Griffin swallowed, a chill sliding up the back of his neck. A healthy man didn't prepare something that specific unless he knew someone was trying to kill him. "Fine, leave it. See you at the church." Griffin cut in and hung up. He looked at Pearl. She looked back, waiting. What now? Griffin forced a smile to hide the sudden unease blooming beneath his mask of absolute control. Nothing. Just the quirks of a paranoid old man. Paranoid right up to the moment he died. "Come on, Pearl. It's time for us to put on the best performance of our miserable lives." The curtain is about to rise. The sheer scale of Holy Name Cathedral in the heart of Chicago the next afternoon didn't feel suffocating because of heat, but because of the sweet, thick, nearly nauseating scent of more than 10,000 white lilies choking the main altar area. $2,000 for a private jet to fly the flowers in from Colombia that very day. Everything had to be excessive. Everything had to scream power. The cathedral's heavy carved wooden doors were guarded by 12 men in black, discreetly armed. On the velvet-cushioned oak pews sat the gross domestic product of an entire city. Corrupt politicians with long-drawn faces. Bankers calculating the future of steel stock. Business rivals pretending to grieve. And wives glittering with jewelry in a silent competition over who could wear the most elegant funeral diamonds. In the center aisle, before the altar, the casket lay there, solid African black oak, polished until it reflected the surrounding candlelight. Pure gold fittings gleamed with a red tint under the light filtering through stained glass. A majestic wooden fortress, cold and sealed completely shut. In the front pew, Griffin Donovan sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the casket in the posture of a strong, suffering pillar. Pearl Donovan sobbed into a black lace handkerchief, shoulders trembling in perfect rhythm, a performance worthy of an Oscar. But inside, Griffin was boiling. His gaze kept cutting toward a thin man in a light gray suit, metal-framed glasses, standing motionless near the altar like a gray stone statue. Attorney Prescott. The old man clutched a black leather briefcase to his chest like a shield, the briefcase holding the fate of the largest company in the northern half of the country. As the archbishop began sprinkling holy water around the candles, Griffin rose quietly from the front row. He moved along the edge of the altar, slipping into the shadows behind marble columns until he cornered Prescott against a cold stone wall. "End this, lawyer," Griffin hissed, pinning the old man there, keeping his voice so low no one 3 meters away could hear. "The priest is about to say the final prayer. Take the papers out, go to the lectern, read it to everyone that we are the heirs, and finish it. The press is waiting outside for me to speak as the new CEO." Prescott adjusted his glasses slowly, showing not a hint of fear at the man invading his space. "Mr. Donovan, My instructions were notarized under federal law. I will not open this briefcase, and I will not read the will until the sun has fully set and the final prayer of this service is complete. Don't be stupid, you stubborn old bastard. Griffin grabbed Prescott's arm, his fingers digging into the cheap suit fabric. Look around you. This church has been militarized. If someone had to bring that peer proof, if someone planned to claim the company, they would have shown up already. No one has. Ares is dead, and his plan failed. There is no secret heir. There's only us. So do your job and give me the company. Prescott yanked his arm free with a dignified jerk. His eyes were pure ice. Ares Donovan's will is absolute. When this service ends, I will act as he ordered. There are 12 minutes until sunset. If you can't keep yourself together for 12 minutes for the man who fed you your whole life, that is your problem. If no one walks through those doors when the clock strikes, the company will be yours. But until then, you don't own even the air you're breathing in this church. Prescott turned and returned to his austere position. Griffin felt the vein in his temple twitch like madness. He ground his teeth until his enamel nearly cracked, spun on his heel, and returned to his seat beside Pearl, feeling the eyes of Chicago's elite stabbing into his back, weighing him, judging whether he was strong enough to hold the empire. He sat. Pearl leaned toward him. What is it? Why won't he read that damn paper? She whispered without moving her lips, eyes still fixed forward. That bastard lawyer wants to wait until sunset. Procedure, Griffin growled, checking his watch. 9 minutes, Pearl. 9 more minutes and 15 years of nightmare ends. The archbishop raised his hands toward heaven. The cathedral's massive organ began to thunder, a heavy, solemn funeral hymn vibrating through the marble floor. Brothers and sisters, the archbishop's voice boomed through speakers under the dome. Today we bid farewell to Ares Donovan, a giant of industry, a pillar of this city. May God receive his soul into eternal light, and may those who remain find comfort in the truth. Outside, beyond the enormous stained glass windows, the last rays of sunlight were fading, dyeing the glass a thick blood red. Inside, the cathedral sank into darkness, lit only by trembling candles around the enormous sealed black oak casket. Griffin checked his watch again. 3 minutes. He looked toward the main doors locked down by his security detail. No one would get in. Victory was absolute, perfect. Nothing on American soil had the power to stop what was about to happen. The archbishop lowered his hands, made the sign of the cross, and spoke the final words. Go in peace. The service is concluded. A restrained murmur spread through the church. The organ held its final, long, mournful chord. Griffin stood immediately, wasting not a second, buttoning his suit jacket and signaling Prescott with a commanding gesture. It was the signal of victory. The old attorney nodded slowly. He unlatched the 2 metal clasps on the black leather briefcase, with 2 sharp clicks that echoed in the heavy silence, and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. Pearl gripped her husband's hand, trembling with real emotion for the first time that night. A few people in the rows behind quietly lifted their phones, ready to record the historic transfer of power. Prescott stepped to the microphone at the pulpit and cleared his throat. The amplified sound rolled up into the stone dome. Ladies and gentlemen, by the direct and irrevocable order of the late Mr. Ares Donovan, I will now read his last will and testament. Griffin lifted his chin, feeling like the king of the world, ready to step forward and accept the keys to the kingdom. Prescott snapped the red wax seal, and in that damned moment, as the paper was about to be unfolded under candlelight, a brutal metallic crash thundered from the back of the cathedral. Not a knock, the sound of a door being kicked from the outside with enough force to rattle century-old hinges. The entire Chicago elite, more than 100 souls present, turned as one toward the rear of the nave. Griffin Donovan felt the ground split open beneath him. The heavy wooden doors began to swing inward slowly, groaning over ancient marble, letting in a blast of street cold that snuffed out dozens of candles around the casket in a single breath. The restrained murmur turned into a collective, horrified gasp. Not an army. Not the police. In the massive doorway, backlit by street lamps and the rotating flashes of a patrol car outside, stood a woman, alone, small. Freya Langston, still in the wrinkled blue scrubs from last night, hair wild, a bruise on her left cheekbone, black circles under her eyes like bottomless pits. But she didn't shake. She didn't cry. She walked into the center aisle with her back perfectly straight, and her eyes burning like a flame cutting through darkness. In her arms, Jonah clung to Freya's neck, face pressed into her shoulder, but his tiny hand gripped something wrapped in gray cloth. And behind her, moving in perfect tactical formation, came 5 massive men in black tactical gear with no police insignia, only a small silver shield on the right shoulder engraved with the letters AD. They wore heavy body armor, compact rifles slung across their chests, and they dragged 3 of Griffin's guards across the marble floor like trash bags being hauled out. Pearl Donovan dropped her lace handkerchief to the floor. Her legs went dead beneath her. "No," Griffin whispered, stepping back, murderous cold sweat freezing along his spine. "Impossible. I saw them throw her out. My guards tossed her into the street." But Freya didn't look at the horrified crowd. She didn't look at the luxury, the stained glass, or the archbishop frozen in fear. Her eyes, fierce and dark, drove straight into the sealed black oak casket. Then she lifted Jonah's small hand, the hand he'd kept hidden behind her all the way here. "What is this?" Griffin shouted, his voice cracking with panic dressed up as authority. "This is a farce. She's a cheap actress Prescott hired. That sewer rat doesn't have anything. Check her bag. It's probably trash she stole out of a dumpster." Steele, the mercenary commander, the shaved head man with the scar across his cheek, stepped forward exactly 2 paces, closing the distance with Griffin. His voice was low, rough, and contained not a single molecule of emotion. "Take 1 more step toward her, Mr. Donovan, and I will break both your legs in front of your entire board of directors. We are here under notarized orders. Step back." Prescott left the pulpit and descended the 3 altar steps. Candlelight reflected in his glasses. His posture had changed completely. He was no longer a hunched administrator, but the scythe of the law. Prescott moved to stand beside Freya. He looked at the bruised, exhausted woman holding the child, and for an instant the old lawyer's eyes flashed with something painful and deeply respectful. Then he turned to Griffin with absolute contempt. "The sun has set, Mr. Donovan," Prescott declared, pointing toward the stained glass now gone dark. "The deadline has passed, and the honored guest Aries Donovan was waiting for has arrived on time. Step aside, or I will instruct Aries's private security team to remove you by force." Prescott placed a hand at the small of Freya's back, gentle but ceremonial, and guided her toward the altar. "Come forward, Miss Langston. Aries Donovan has been waiting for you for a long time." Freya stepped onto the first altar step, then the second, until she stood facing the enormous black oak casket. The contrast between her and the scene around her was cruelly cinematic. An exhausted, bruised night shift nurse in wrinkled scrubs holding a 5-year-old child, standing before a fortress of wood and gold containing the most powerful man in the city, beneath the trembling candlelight of Chicago's largest cathedral, while more than 100 of America's richest people held their breath behind her. The silence was so thick you could hear candle wax dripping onto marble. Freya looked down at Jonah. He lifted his face to her, big gray eyes. No more tears, only the strange calm of a child who'd crossed the border of fear into something on the other side, something close to faith. Slowly, Jonah opened his tiny right hand, the hand he'd kept hidden behind Freya's back through the entire march up the church aisle. Candlelight caught a silver glint that made a few people in the front row squint. In the boy's small palm lay a flower, but not an ordinary flower. It was a steel rose. Heavy, rough, its petals forged from solid metal with clear hammer marks stamped into the surface, handmade with a breathtaking, beautiful imperfection. And at the center of the metal flower, cut deep into the steel in unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Diana, my only heart, A.D., Navy Pier." A collective gasp swept through the cathedral. Veteran bankers and founding shareholders of the company stared in disbelief. That steel rose was a legend in the corridors of Donovan Steel Industries. The first piece of steel Aries Donovan had ever forged with his own hands when he was a young worker, hammered and fired into a flower, and given to the only woman he ever loved, the woman his family had forced him to abandon. Prescott stepped closer, pulled a small ultraviolet light from his vest pocket, and aimed it at the base of the rose. A chemical watermark, invisible to the naked eye and proprietary to Donovan Steel's security system, flared to life in a bright phosphorescent green. Prescott lifted his head, looked out at the crowd, his voice shaking with the weight of the moment but still carrying through the stone dome. "Authentic proof. The steel rose has returned. Under federal law and the irrevocable last will, this child, Jonah Donovan, direct blood heir of Diana Chen, is the sole lawful inheritor of 95% of the shares, assets, and operating capital of Donovan Steel Industries, and Miss Freya Langston, as the child's legal guardian, holds full authority to manage the trust until Jonah comes of age. The legal hammer fell on Griffin like a boulder. He collapsed to his knees on the red carpet. His legs could no longer hold his body. His face twisted in pure agony, as if someone were pulling his soul out through his throat. "No, no, no," Griffin sobbed, clawing at the fabric of his designer slacks, crawling forward. "That company is mine. I worked for it. I endured that bastard old man. This is a scam." But Freya didn't look at Griffin. She turned back to the sealed black oak casket and rested a gentle hand on Jonah's shoulder. The boy understood. As if rehearsed in a dream, Jonah shifted in Freya's arms, facing the casket, and spoke in a small voice, clear enough that every syllable carried through Prescott's amplification system beneath the cathedral dome. "Dad, I brought Aunt Freya here. Wake up." And then, before the horrified eyes of more than 100 people, a dry, sharp, hair-raising sound came from inside the sealed black oak casket, fingernails scraping wood from within. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, but in the graveyard silence of the church, it landed like thunder. The scraping became pounding, rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was knocking on the casket lid from inside with a fist. A piercing scream tore out of the governor's wife in the third row. That scream was the fuse. Panic detonated like a bomb. Bankers in $1,000 suits stumbled over each other, shoving heavy pews backward. Society women dropped their handbags and covered their faces as they fled toward the side aisles, and the archbishop staggered back until he hit the tabernacle, making the sign of the cross with hands that shook violently. "This is a trick, a loudspeaker, a recording." Griffin screamed from the floor, his voice splitting with primal terror that raised every hair on his neck. "Prescott, you old bastard, you put a speaker in there. My brother is dead. I saw the monitor go flat. I saw his body." Pearl Donovan, on her knees with her hands cuffed behind her back by the mercenaries, shook her head like a madwoman. Black mascara smeared across her face turned her into something demonic. "Impossible. That poison should have killed him," Pearl screamed, every last shred of reason gone. "I saw him drink the whole dose myself. His organs should be dissolving by now." The accidental confession echoed through the cathedral's sound system. Every phone camera recording captured every syllable. Politicians froze in their seats. The elite stopped breathing. Pearl had just sentenced herself in front of more than 100 witnesses, but Freya didn't listen. She didn't look at Pearl or Griffin or the crowd. Her nurse's instincts flared through everything else. She set Jonah down on the marble floor, turned to the mercenary team, and shouted with a clinical command so sharp it cut through the noise. "Open the lid, now. The patient is alive. He needs oxygen immediately. Open it, now." Steele didn't need to hear it twice. He pulled a black steel crowbar from his tactical vest, the kind used to breach reinforced doors, and jammed the flat end into the seam beneath the pure gold fittings. "Count to 3, Steele barked. The other 4 mercenaries braced against the casket. 1, 2, 3. The black oak split with a crack like an explosion. A safety bolt shot loose and clattered onto the altar steps. The wood groaned and gave. 5 men shoved the heavy lid backward. The casket sprang open, releasing a thick, cold fog condensing from dry ice used to simulate refrigerated preservation. No one breathed. No one blinked. A pale hand, shaking but heavy with rings of power, clamped onto the broken wood edge, knuckles whitening with effort, fingers digging into the grain, and slowly, from the white silk lining inside, a figure began to sit up. Inside the casket, hidden beneath silk padding and decorative dry ice, was a small medical oxygen cylinder installed into the base, enough air to keep a living man alive for 6 hours. Steele's covert medical team had removed Ares from the hospital morgue within the hour after his death was declared. When Griffin's surveillance was at its weakest, they'd temporarily resuscitated him, stabilized his vitals at the bare minimum, then placed him in the casket just before it left the funeral home for the church. Ares Donovan sat up in his own casket, silver hair damp with cold sweat stuck to his forehead, his black funeral suit rumpled, his skin a translucent waxy gray from the poison and antidote aftermath. He breathed in harsh, loud gasps, lungs filling with open air for the first time in hours, coughing dry and relentless. But his eyes, his gray eyes identical to Jonah's, burned with hellfire. Bloodshot, alive, furious, They locked straight onto the two pathetic figures crawling on the marble floor in front of him. Terror has many faces, but none as brutal as the face of a ghost returning to collect a debt. Steele extended his massive arm. Ares gripped the commander's forearm, and with a superhuman effort that made every stiff joint crack and pop, he stepped out of the black oak casket. His black funeral shoes met the marble floor. He swayed for a heartbeat, then straightened. It was the image of absolute power returning from the grave. Ares ignored the crowd in frenzy, ignored the private medical team rushing in from the sacristy with a real oxygen tank. He had eyes only for his family. He walked slowly, dragging his left foot slightly, until he stopped exactly 1 meter from Griffin Donovan. Griffin cowered on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, unable to lift his face higher than the polished shoes of the brother he was sure he'd killed. "The cold of the morgue table is something you don't forget, Griffin," Ares said. His voice was a hoarse whisper ruined by chemicals, yet the cathedral's perfect acoustics carried it into every corner. Each word was a lash dipped in acid. "That cold sinks into your bones. It freezes your lungs." Pearl groaned on the floor, writhing in handcuffs, trying to crawl toward Ares. "No, Ares, please. Forgive me. Griffin forced me. Griffin ruined the company. Griffin bought the poison. I'm your sister-in-law." "We're family," she screamed, black tears streaking down her face, trying to kiss her brother-in-law's shoes. Ares looked down at her. The disgust on his face ran so deep it distorted it. "I lay paralyzed in that hospital bed, Pearl," Ares said, breath hissing in his chest. "My heart barely beat. My eyes were closed. My lungs were on a ventilator. But my brain was fully awake. The antidote kept my consciousness alive. I heard everything." Griffin let out a strangled sob. Urine soaked through his Italian linen trousers, forming a dark puddle spreading over the marble. "I heard you celebrating with Dr. Nash. I heard you counting the minutes while you waited for them to pull the tubes," Ares continued, lowering his voice, each sentence making the terror heavier. "And through the hidden audio feed Steele planted in my library, I heard the champagne cork you popped in my own house while I waited in that morgue. I heard the toast to the new owners of Chicago." Ares leaned forward. "I don't have a brother. And you?" Ares turned toward Pearl. "You were never family." Prescott stepped up beside Ares, holding a bright red USB drive and a stack of unlaminated photographs, high enough for every politician and banker to see. 3 days before he collapsed, Ares Donovan ordered an international-scale private investigation, Prescott declared, his voice as unforgiving as a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "In my hand is the complete financial report of the transfer of $30 million to an account in Macau by Griffin Donovan." Prescott flipped the photos and held them out toward the front rows. Crisp security images of Pearl Donovan in an alley in Prague, handing a suitcase of cash to a masked man and receiving a tiny glass vial in return. "And here is proof of a black market transaction in Eastern Europe for a deadly synthetic compound derived from thallium, engineered to bypass standard forensic screens and mimic spontaneous liver failure." Steele stepped toward Pearl. He clamped her wrist in his steel hand, then yanked the knot of the Hermes silk scarf at her throat in one decisive motion. The designer scarf slid free and fell onto the cathedral floor, and from the folds of that expensive fabric, a tiny glass vial rolled out onto the marble, spinning slowly under candlelight before stopping precisely at Freya Langston's feet. "Empty. The murder weapon. The poison is still on your person, Mrs. Donovan," Steele said, his voice frozen solid as he pulled a pair of black steel cuffs from his tactical belt. "Federal agents and Interpol have been waiting outside this church for half an hour. The doors were locked not to protect you from the press. They were locked so you couldn't escape." The cathedral erupted into absolute chaos. Screams, frantic calls to private lawyers, chairs scraping and crashing. Business partners who'd offered Griffin condolences 10 minutes earlier now recoiled in disgust. The main doors flew open a second time, and this time, it wasn't mercenaries entering, but 24 FBI agents in full body armor with federal prosecutors, marching down the center aisle without sparing a glance for the elite scattering in horror. They grabbed Griffin under both arms and hauled him off the floor without courtesy. He didn't resist. His eyes were empty. His mind had shattered completely. Pearl screamed like a lunatic, kicking, spitting, dragged down the red carpet by 2 female agents as she cursed her brother-in-law and the street nurse. Their voices faded into distance, swallowed by the sirens of patrol cars waiting on the avenue. Silence returned to the cathedral. But this time it wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of total submission. The entire Donovan Empire had just witnessed the most brutal, calculated purge in the city's underworld history. Ares breathed hard and swayed. Prescott steadied him with an arm while a private physician quietly lifted a clear oxygen mask to Ares's face for a few seconds. Ares drew a deep breath, removed the mask, and turned his head. 2 meters away, Freya still stood there. The night shift nurse in wrinkled scrubs, hair wild, face bruised, dark circles under her eyes, holding Jonah in her arms. The boy clung to her neck, gray eyes wide as he stared at the biological father he'd only met through a hospital bed. And the steel rose lay in the child's other tiny hand. The most ruthless Mafia boss in Chicago, the man who had destroyed his own family without blinking from inside a coffin, stepped toward Freya. The hardened mask, carved by power and violence, cracked for the first time. His knees, weak from poison, finally buckled. Ares Donovan knelt on the cold marble floor before a night shift nurse who lived in an unheated South Side studio. Chicago's hidden elite watched the most powerful man in the state lower himself before the woman no one in this room would have bothered to look at 24 hours earlier. Ares lifted his face to Freya, his bloodshot gray eyes, still burning with vengeance, now filled with tears. Not tears of pain or poison. Tears of a man who had just found the one thing money can't buy. "You saved my son," Ares whispered, his voice breaking under the emotion crushing his chest. "You picked him up from wet concrete in the rain 3 years ago when the whole world walked past him. You saved him from the system that no one saved you from when you were little. You raised him on boxed pasta and love in a room with no heat while I sat in this mansion searching for him everywhere. And then you risked your life, your job, everything, to bring an antidote to a man you didn't even know, just because a 5-year-old asked you to." Ares lifted a trembling hand and gently touched the bruise on Freya's cheekbone, the bruise his own brother's guards had left. "I owe you, Freya Langston. More than this entire empire could ever repay." Freya looked down at the Mafia boss kneeling at her feet. She didn't speak. No tears fell. She only held Jonah tighter and nodded once, slow and final, as if stamping a wordless covenant they both understood, that from this moment on their lives were bound together by a cord that couldn't be cut, and that cord had the shape of a 5-year-old boy with gray eyes holding a steel rose against his chest. 4 hours after the dead man sat up in his own casket, and the Donovan Empire was turned upside down in front of Chicago's hidden elite, the silence inside the Gold Coast mansion carried a different quality. It wasn't the silence of plotting or calculation. It was a clean, purifying silence, like the air after a storm once everything rotten has been ripped away and carried off by wind. Every loyal staff member Griffin and Pearl had kept close was fired by Steele's men and escorted off the property before Ares stepped through the front doors. In the main suite on the second floor, the private doctors had set up a specialized medical monitoring system. Ares lay on silk sheets, an IV line dripping antidote to flush the last remnants of thallium and the Swiss compound's side effects from his blood. His breathing had steadied. Color was slowly returning to his face from the waxy gray horror it had been hours earlier. The oak door opened slowly. Freya stepped in, still in her worn work clothes. The bruise on her cheek stood as a stark contrast to the luxury of the room, a silent testament to the night she had sacrificed her career to save a life. A maid had offered to bathe her and bring clean clothes, but Freya refused to change. She didn't explain why, but Ares understood. She didn't want to wear anything that belonged to Pearl Donovan, not even guest clothing. Survival instinct doesn't wash off with hot water. On Freya's lap, Jonah lay curled up, head resting against her belly, tiny hands gripping the hem of her scrubs, as if he were afraid someone would tear her away. He was sleeping deeply for the first time in 24 hours, breathing soft and steady, his face completely peaceful, safe in the arms of the only person in the world he called mother. Freya sat in the chair beside the bed. Not too close, not too far. The exact distance of someone who didn't fully trust but also didn't plan to run. Ares opened his eyes to look at her, and for the first time since the storm began, these two people truly saw each other. No chaos, no guards, no monitors, no screaming, only warm yellow light, the steady drip of the IV, and the breath of a sleeping child. "You don't look very impressed by the house," Ares said, hoarse and weak, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "It's too big," Freya replied, her eyes sweeping across a suite as wide as an entire floor of her studio. "Too much empty space. Enemies can hide more easily." Aries let out a laugh and then coughed. The laugh hurt because his lungs still weren't fully recovered. But it was real. The kind of laugh Griffin had never once heard from his brother in his entire life. "You have the same eyes she did," Aries murmured, glancing toward the nightstand where the steel rose lay still. That same wild distrust. Diana never trusted anyone either until they proved it with actions, not words. Silence held for a few seconds. Freya broke it. "Why did you send the antidote through a 5-year-old instead of coming to me directly?" Her voice wasn't accusing, but it wasn't forgiving either. It was the question of someone who needed the truth before she decided anything that came next. Aries looked up at the ceiling, his eyes clouding for a moment. Because Griffin controlled every line of communication inside that hospital. Every medical staff member was being watched. Phones, email, texts, everything went through Briggs's filter. If I contacted you directly, they'd know immediately, and you'd disappear before you ever set foot on the 7th floor. The only person no one ever suspects is a 5-year-old child, and the only person in this world I trusted to act for Jonah. Not for money, not for power, not for fear, was the woman who raised my son for 3 years with pure love, while she couldn't even afford to heat the room she slept in. Freya swallowed. She looked down at Jonah, and her fingers automatically smoothed the boy's tangled black hair. "You found Jonah a month ago," she said, her voice dropping close to a whisper. "Why didn't you come take him?" Aries turned his face toward her. In his gray eyes was something Freya had never seen in a Mafia boss: regret. Because Griffin and Pearl were still alive and still held power. If I brought Jonah home while they were still sitting on the board, they would have killed the boy. An accident. A staged kidnapping. A dose in a glass of milk. And they would have killed you too, because you were the only living link between Jonah and me that didn't pass through their system. I had to destroy them first. I had to let them act so I'd have evidence. And to do that, I had to leave you and Jonah out there one more month, unprotected, unaware of the truth, living in that freezing studio while I lay in this mansion planning. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. Freya understood the cold, ruthless logic. She hated it, but she understood it. Because she'd lived her whole life by survival logic too. She looked Aries straight in the eyes and asked the question she'd feared most since the moment Steele told her the truth on the hospital bench at 2 a.m. "You're going to take Jonah from me." Not a question. A painful statement she'd been preparing herself for hours. "You're his biological father. You have money, lawyers, power. Any court will give custody to a billionaire boss instead of a fired nurse living on the South Side. That's how the world works." Aries didn't answer right away. He looked at Jonah sleeping, looked at the way the boy's tiny hand clung to Freya's scrubs, looked at the way his head rested against her belly as naturally as if it were the only place on earth he felt safe. "Jonah called you Mom in his sleep," Aries said, his voice breaking at the end. "I heard it while I lay in that hospital bed. The antidote kept me awake, and I heard him crying in the hallway after security dragged you out. He didn't call my name. He called Aunt Freya." Aries lifted the hand with the IV needle still in it and slowly extended it toward Freya, but stopped halfway, as if he were afraid touching her would make her vanish. "I didn't come to separate you from my son, Freya. I came to ask if you'll stay." Freya didn't move. Each word hit her like waves, each one peeling away. Another layer of armor, 27 years of orphanhood had built around her heart. She looked down at Jonah, looked at the steel rose on the nightstand, looked at the IV drip feeding life back into the man in front of her. Then she held Jonah tighter, rested her chin on the top of his head, and spoke in a voice that didn't shake, didn't cry, only carried the absolute certainty of someone who'd decided before the question was asked. "I've never had a home. For 27 years, there hasn't been a single place on earth that asked me to stay. But wherever this child is, that's my home." Aries closed his eyes. A single tear, heavier than all the champagne Griffin had uncorked last night, slid slowly from the corner of the most ruthless Mafia boss in Chicago down a cheek still gray from poison. He wasn't crying from pain, not from nearly dying, not from revenge. He was crying because for the first time in nearly 40 years, someone chose to stay, not for his empire, not out of fear of him, but for the son he'd almost lost forever. And that tear, falling in the quiet of the only warm room in the Donovan mansion, carried more weight than all the steel this empire had ever forged. While Aries Donovan's tear fell in the warm room of the Gold Coast mansion, 14 kilometers to the south, hell wore a completely different zip code. The heavy steel gate of the Metropolitan Correctional Center slammed shut with a metallic boom that echoed down a corridor of damp concrete. Griffin Donovan was shoved into an intake holding cell, tripped over his own feet, and crashed to his knees on a stained concrete floor he didn't want to imagine the origin of, while the sour reek of ammonia hit his nose and flipped his stomach. No more $5,000 Italian suit. No more custom handmade leather shoes. He wore a rough, khaki prison uniform that chafed every millimeter of skin, accustomed to silk. "You can't do this to me," Griffin screamed, gripping the rusted bars and shaking them like a madman. "I have the right to make a call. I demand a lawyer from an international firm." The duty guard, a huge man with tattoos crawling up his neck, stopped in front of the cell. He grinned wide, pulled a black baton from his belt, and tapped the bars a few centimeters from Griffin's fingers, making Griffin snatch his hand back with a terrified yelp. "Your lawyer refused to represent you 2 hours ago, Donovan." The guard growled with a cruel laugh. "The Macau account has been frozen by Interpol. All your credit cards are locked. The mansion you lived in is listed as a corporate asset of your brother's company, so you don't own a single brick. You don't have enough money to buy a stick of gum in this prison commissary. You're less than trash in here." A kilometer away in the women's unit, Pearl Donovan's fate was no better. She sat on a bare iron bed frame with no mattress. The woman who only hours earlier had been planning to hire an interior design team for the most expensive mansion in the state, now staring at her own trembling hands. They'd made her remove her diamond rings, her bracelets, her earrings, stripping each layer of luxury armor from her body until she was nothing but a middle-aged woman in a prison uniform, with skin stinging red from being forced to wash her face with industrial soap under cold water. The Hermes scarf had been confiscated as evidence along with the empty glass vial, the murder weapon she'd been foolish enough to wear around her neck all the way to the funeral. 3 cellmates, women convicted of murder and drug trafficking, watched Pearl from the corner with wolf eyes assessing a wounded prey animal. "That blonde hair is going to get dirty real fast in here, princess," one of them muttered, baring worn teeth as she turned a homemade shiv fashioned from a melted toothbrush. Pearl shrank into the concrete corner, closed her eyes, and cried without sound. There was no escape, no bail. Aries had personally insured the federal judge on the case, denied every bond request, every appeal, every plea for leniency. The venom of betrayal had finally come back to swallow the one who spat it. Griffin Donovan and Pearl Donovan, 2 vultures that had circled the steel empire for 15 years, were now being crushed by the very system they'd once stood above and looked down on, and the sound of the steel gate slamming shut behind them echoed with the finality of a sentence no dollar bill, no silk scarf, and no vial of poison could ever reverse. 1 month after the federal prison's steel gate slammed shut behind Griffin and Pearl Donovan, the 45th floor boardroom of Donovan Steel Industries was quiet as a temple. A massive oval black glass table sat at the center, surrounded by 12 high-backed leather chairs holding the most ruthless executives in American steel. Silver-haired men in gray suits whispered to one another, unease hanging in the air. This was the first official board meeting since the incident at the funeral. The 2 words Chicago's hidden elite used for that night of horror because no one wanted to describe it more plainly. The frosted glass doors opened. The room fell into absolute silence. Aries Donovan was rolled in on an electric wheelchair, still recovering from liver damage caused by the poison. His face was thinner, cheekbones sharper, but the way he sat still carried an authority that could stop a heart. Prescott walked at his right, the black briefcase pinned tight against his chest. But every eye in the room wasn't fixed on the boss. It was locked on the person walking half a step ahead of the wheelchair, Freya Longston. No more wrinkled blue scrubs, no more wild hair and hollow dark circles. She wore a fitted black suit cut to her small frame. No unnecessary accessories, no flashy jewelry, only the cold sharpness of someone who knew exactly what kind of battlefield she was entering. Her hair was pinned into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, exposing the clean line of her throat and the faint scar on her forehead catching the halogen light, a permanent reminder of the war she'd won. In her arms, Jonah, dressed in a tiny white shirt, sat upright and solemn, gray eyes sweeping the room with the calm curiosity of a child who'd seen too much to be impressed by anything. Freya walked to the head of the table. The chairman's seat, the seat Griffin Donovan had plotted to murder his own brother to take. She pulled the chair out and sat down, placed Jonah on her lap, adjusted her jacket cuff, then lifted her gaze and looked straight at 12 faces, trying to hide their shock. Street predator instinct blended perfectly with the Donovan bloodline's relentless steel. The CFO, A bald man sweating heavily tried to break the tension with a patronizing smile. You, Miss Freya. Welcome. We've prepared some very visual, easy-to-understand charts to explain the company's operational performance last quarter. Freya didn't blink. She held out her hand and Prescott placed a tablet in it. She slid it across the black glass toward the CFO. I don't need colorful charts, Mr. Velasco, Freya said. Her voice was young, but it carried a glacial edge that cut the breath out of everyone in the room. I need you to explain why the loss margin at the Saltillo refinery increased by 3% since Griffin Donovan signed the coal supply contract in January. I read the books last night. There are abnormal shipping costs. The CFO went paper white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other executives traded looks of absolute panic. They'd underestimated the night shift nurse. They thought a manageable puppet would sit at the head of the table, and they had just realized the person in front of them was an accounting predator, forged by the fiercest wolf in the pack. Ares let out a hoarse laugh, lacing his hands over his lap, savoring the terror in his own employees' eyes. Answer the chairwoman, Velasco, and you'd better not lie, because if she fires you today, I'll make sure you can't get a job cleaning toilets at a gas station anywhere in this country. Freya leaned back in the massive leather chair. On the black glass table, just to her right, the steel rose lay still, the heavy metal flower that had survived time, betrayal, death, reflecting the halogen light like a crown waiting. The meeting ended after 45 minutes without a single executive daring to breathe too loudly. When the room emptied, Jonah was taken to bed by his nanny, and Prescott left with the files, leaving only the two of them. Freya stood at the panoramic glass wall looking out over Chicago's skyline. The city lights stretched to the horizon like a carpet of fallen stars. The same city that had pinned her to sidewalks, locked her in strangers' basements, starved her in foster care, now lay beneath her, glittering and subdued. Slow footsteps came from behind. Ares wasn't in the wheelchair anymore. He used a cane, taking each step with pain but with purpose until he stood beside her at the glass. Their reflections overlapped on the window, laid over the skyline. Silence stretched. The air between them was heavy but not suffocating. Heavy in the way real things are, things with weight and roots. You know who I am, Ares said without looking at her, eyes fixed on the distance. I'm not a good man. My world is dangerous. And you deserve more than the darkness I carry. Freya turned to him. Her eyes weren't afraid. Not at all. I grew up in foster care, she said, as calmly as if she were describing the weather. I slept in an abandoned car when I was 16. I ate leftovers behind restaurants I couldn't afford to walk into the front door of. You think I'm afraid of your darkness? I've lived in darkness my whole life. The only difference is your darkness has heat. Ares looked at her, the face of a man used to controlling everything, from a coffin to a boardroom, showed helplessness for the first time. He lifted his hand and gently touched the scar on Freya's forehead, the scar from the night a guard shoved her down when she threw herself in front of his son. His finger traced the thin line with a tenderness no one had ever seen in the most ruthless mafia boss of the Great Lakes. I don't deserve you, Ares whispered, but I'm too selfish to let go. Freya didn't answer with words. She raised her hand and placed her palm flat on Ares's left chest, over his heart, the heart that had stopped on a monitor, the heart she'd helped bring back with a misshapen plastic bottle and the courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. She felt the beat under her palm, slow, steady, alive. This heartbeat is mine, Freya said, looking straight into his eyes. I saved it. You don't get to waste it. Ares lowered his head. His forehead touched hers. His warm breath, edged with medicine and whiskey, brushed her cheek. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He only stood there, forehead to forehead, two people battered to the edge, finding each other among the ruins they had created and survived. Outside the glass, Chicago blazed with light. Inside the dark boardroom, the steel rose lay on the black glass table reflecting the city lights, like a small star fallen into the night. And the most ruthless mafia boss in the Great Lakes, for the first time in his life, let a woman place her hand on his chest, not as a threat, but as home. The story of Ares and Freya isn't only a story about power or revenge. It's a reminder that sometimes the people life abandons most cruelly are the ones with the strongest hearts. That real love doesn't need mansions or empires. It only needs arms willing to open when the whole world turns its back. That home isn't four walls. It's the place where someone waits for you to return. and that a plastic bottle in the hands of a 5-year-old can sometimes hold more power than $1 million steel empire. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something in Freya, in Jonah, or in the moment the Mafia boss knelt before the night shift nurse, please hit the like button and share this video so more people can hear this story. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our most compelling stories every day. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? Which character moved you the most? And in real life, have you ever met someone like Freya? Someone with nothing who was still willing to give everything for someone else? Write in the comments below. We read every line and we're grateful to hear what's deep in your hearts. Goodbye, and thank you for staying with us to the very end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.